In March 1943, test pilot Robert Chilton climbed into the cockpit of a modified P-51B at Wright Field, Ohio, carrying a sealed envelope from the North American Aviation Engineering Division. Inside were calculations that contradicted every aerodynamic principle the Army Air Forces had endorsed for 3 years. The flight lasted 11 minutes. When Chilton landed, he refused to speak to anyone except the base commander. His hands were shaking, and the airspeed indicator needle had bent against its upper limit. Something had pushed the Mustang beyond what aluminum and rivets were supposed to endure. The P-51 Mustang, by early 1943, was considered a capable but unremarkable fighter. It flew escort missions over occupied Europe, protecting bomber formations with decent speed and adequate range. But it was not exceptional. It could not match the climb rate of German interceptors, and it struggled above 25,000 feet, where the war was increasingly being fought. Pilots trusted it, but they did not fear for it. It was a workhorse, not a predator. What Robert Chilton discovered that morning would remain classified for nearly 2 years. The modification he tested was not listed in any official engineering log. The blueprint that made it possible had been drawn 6 months earlier by a junior aerodynamicist named Harold West, then filed away in a storage cabinet after being dismissed as impractical. West had proposed a subtle but radical redesign of the aircraft's engine air intake and cooling system, a change so minor in appearance that it required no structural alterations to the fuselage. Yet on paper, it promised to eliminate the single greatest limitation of the Mustang's performance: parasitic drag at high altitude. The problem with the early P-51 models was not the airframe. It was the engine installation. The Allison V1710 engine, reliable and powerful at low altitudes, choked above 15,000 feet. When North American Aviation replaced it with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in late 1942, the Mustang gained horsepower and altitude capability. But the cooling system designed for the Allison could not handle the Merlin's heat output efficiently. Engineers compensated by enlarging the ventral radiator scoop, which increased drag and negated much of the performance gain. The P-51B was faster than its predecessor, but it was not revolutionary. Harold West's blueprint addressed this with a principle borrowed from thermodynamics rather than aerodynamics. He proposed routing the engine coolant through a revised duct system that used the Meredith effect, a phenomenon where heated air exiting a radiator could generate forward thrust if channeled correctly. The concept was theoretically sound, but had never been successfully implemented in a combat aircraft. West's design required precise angles, duct dimensions, and exit velocity calculations. A single miscalculation would turn the radiator into a furnace or, worse, create turbulence that would destabilize the aircraft at speed. His superiors reviewed the proposal in September 1942 and rejected it. The reasoning was institutional rather than technical. North American Aviation was already behind schedule on P-51 production. The Army Air Forces needed numbers, not experiments. Modifying the cooling system would require wind tunnel testing, prototype construction, and months of validation. There was no appetite for risk. The blueprint was thanked, filed, and forgotten. But Harold West did not forget. He continued refining his calculations in his spare time, using data from operational reports and pilot debriefings. He noticed a pattern. P-51 pilots consistently reported that the aircraft performed better in certain atmospheric conditions, specifically in cold, dense air at high altitude during extended climbs. The Merlin engine was producing more power than the cooling system could dissipate efficiently, but instead of overheating, the excess heat was being vented in a way that minimized drag. West realized that the Mustang was accidentally approaching the Meredith effect under specific conditions. His blueprint was not theoretical. It was a formalization of something the aircraft was already trying to do. In February 1943, West approached a senior engineer named George Scherer, who had access to the experimental flight division at Wright Field. Scherer reviewed the revised calculations and saw the same thing West had seen. If the modifications worked, the P-51 would not just become faster, it would become the fastest operational fighter in the world. But there was no official channel to test it. Production models were locked in. The only option was an unauthorized modification to a single test airframe. Scherer and West worked in secret for 3 weeks. They fabricated the revised duct components in a machine shop after hours, using scrap aluminum and hand tools. They installed the system on P-51B, serial number 43-12093, a plane scheduled for routine engine trials. No paperwork was filed, no approval was sought. On the morning of March 14, 1943, Robert Chilton was handed an envelope and told to fly the aircraft to its maximum sustainable speed at 28,000 feet. He was not told why. Chilton climbed through scattered clouds over the Ohio countryside. At altitude, he pushed the throttle forward and felt the Mustang accelerate with a smoothness he had never experienced in 3 years of test flying. The airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 420, 440. The aircraft remained stable. There was no buffeting, no vibration. The engine temperature held steady. At 460 miles per hour, Chilton eased back, not because the plane was struggling, but because he was. When he landed, he walked directly to the base commander's office and placed the envelope on the desk. Inside was a single handwritten note from Harold West. This is what the Mustang was supposed to be. The war was entering its 3rd year. The Luftwaffe was refining its tactics. Allied losses over Germany were unsustainable, and in a storage cabinet at North American Aviation, a blueprint had been waiting, not for approval, but for someone to believe in it. The sound of that Merlin engine, clean and furious at 28,000 feet, would echo through every air battle to come. The day after Robert Chilton's flight, Wright Field was sealed. No one entered or left the experimental flight division without written authorization from Colonel Benjamin Kelsey, Chief of Fighter Projects for the Army Air Forces. The P-51B that Chilton had flown was moved into a locked hangar, its engine cowling removed, its modified cooling ducts photographed from every angle. A team of engineers was assembled, and they were given a single task: determine whether what happened was real or a statistical anomaly. Harold West was summoned to Wright Field on March 16, 1943. He arrived by train from Inglewood, California, carrying a leather satchel containing 6 months of handwritten calculations, wind tunnel sketches, and thermodynamic tables. He had not slept in 2 days. When he entered the briefing room, he found 14 men seated around a long oak table: senior engineers, aerodynamicists, military officers, and one man he recognized immediately: Edgar Schmude, the lead designer of the P-51 Mustang. Schmude did not look pleased. The interrogation began with a question from Colonel Kelsey. "Did you perform an unauthorized structural modification to a United States Army Air Forces aircraft?" West answered yes. Kelsey asked if he understood that such an action during wartime could be considered sabotage. West said he did. Then Kelsey leaned forward and asked the only question that mattered: "Can you do it again?" West opened his satchel and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It contained one equation, a revised application of the Meredith effect that accounted for compressibility, boundary layer separation, and radiator exit velocity at transonic speeds. The equation was elegant, but it required 3 variables that could only be determined through flight testing. In other words, the modification that had made the P-51B faster could not be reverse-engineered from the aircraft itself. It could only be understood through the mathematics that had created it. Edgar Schmude studied the equation for several minutes, then looked up at West. "This should not work," he said quietly. "The exit duct angle is too steep. You would create a low-pressure pocket behind the radiator that would stall the airflow. West nodded. Unless, Schmood continued, you are assuming that the boundary layer remains attached due to thermal expansion of the air itself. West said nothing. Schmood's expression changed. You are using the heat as a structural element. That was the insight no one else had seen. Traditional aerodynamics treated heat as a problem to be managed, an enemy of performance. West had treated it as a resource. The Merlin engine produced enormous amounts of waste heat. Most of it was vented uselessly into the atmosphere, creating drag and reducing efficiency. But if that heat could be channeled, accelerated, and expelled at a precise angle, it would generate thrust. Not much, perhaps 50 pounds of forward force at high speed. But in an aircraft operating at the edge of its performance envelope, 50 pounds was the difference between intercepting a bomber formation and watching it escape. The problem was that no one had successfully built a system capable of doing this in a production fighter. The Meredith effect was well understood in theory, but it required tolerances that were nearly impossible to achieve in mass manufacturing. The ducts had to be smooth, the angles exact, the exit velocity consistent. A deviation of 2 degrees would turn the system into dead weight. A blockage in the coolant flow would overheat the engine. And if the aircraft maneuvered violently, rolling, diving, pulling G-forces, the airflow would separate, and the entire advantage would vanish. West's design solved this with a deceptively simple innovation. He did not try to make the system perfect. Instead, he made it adaptive. The exit duct was not fixed. It was hinged, controlled by a spring-loaded actuator linked to the engine's coolant temperature gauge. As the engine heated up, the duct would open slightly, increasing airflow and thrust. As it cooled, the duct would close, reducing drag. The system self-corrected in real time, compensating for changes in altitude, speed, and throttle setting. It was mechanical feedback, analog computing built into the airframe. The engineers at Wright Field tested West's calculations for 3 days. They built scale models, ran wind tunnel simulations, and examined every scenario where the system could fail. They found none. The design was sound, but there was a larger problem, and it was not technical, it was political. The P-51 Mustang was already in production. Factories in Inglewood and Dallas were building 600 aircraft per month. Modifying the cooling system would require retooling the assembly lines, retraining workers, and delaying deliveries. The Army Air Forces had commitments to bomber groups in England that were waiting for long-range escorts. Every week of delay meant more losses over Germany. The modification would make the Mustang faster, but it would also make it late. Colonel Kelsey presented the dilemma to General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, in a classified memo dated March 22, 1943. The memo outlined 3 options: implement the modification immediately and accept a 2-month production delay, phase in the modification gradually, creating 2 variants of the P-51, or reject the modification entirely and proceed with the existing design. Arnold's response was delivered verbally through Kelsey, and it was unambiguous. If this makes the Mustang the fastest fighter in the war, I don't care if we have to rebuild every one of them by hand. The decision was made. Harold West's blueprint would be classified, filed under a restricted engineering designation, and implemented across all future P-51 production models. The modification would be referred to internally as the low-drag cooling installation, a name deliberately vague enough to avoid attention. Pilots would not be told why their aircraft were suddenly faster. Ground crews would not be told what the new ducts were for. The change would be invisible, unannounced, and absolute. But there was one last problem. The modification had been tested on a single aircraft under controlled conditions. No one knew how it would perform in combat under G-forces, battle damage, or extreme weather. If the system failed at altitude over enemy territory, pilots would die, and the program would be terminated. Someone had to prove that it worked in the real war. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Robert Chilton volunteered. He would deploy to England with the 354th Fighter Group and fly the modified P-51B in combat operations over Europe. His aircraft would be monitored, his flight data recorded, and his survival would determine whether Harold West's equation had been worth the risk. The war was about to meet the mathematics it had been ignoring. Robert Chilton arrived in England on April 8, 1943, aboard a C-54 transport, carrying classified technical documents and a disassembled P-51B marked with non-standard identification codes. The aircraft was reassembled at RAF Boxted, a base northeast of London that served as home to the 354th Fighter Group, the first American unit scheduled to receive the Mustang for long-range escort duty. Chilton's presence was explained as a routine liaison assignment. His actual orders, signed by Colonel Kelsey and countersigned by General Arnold, were sealed in an envelope that only the group commander was authorized to open. The orders were specific. Chilton would fly combat missions using the modified P-51B under operational conditions identical to those faced by frontline pilots. He would not receive preferential treatment, special briefings, or tactical advantages. His aircraft would carry standard armament, standard fuel load, and standard radio equipment. The only difference would be invisible, a cooling system that, according to mathematics, would allow him to outrun and outclimb every German fighter in the sky. But mathematics had never faced a Focke-Wulf 190 at 28,000 feet with the sun in the wrong position. Chilton's first combat sortie occurred on April 15, 1943. The mission was an escort run to Bremen, protecting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses tasked with bombing U-boat construction facilities. The bombers crossed the English Channel at dawn, climbing slowly to 24,000 feet, their contrails white and straight in the frozen air. Chilton flew in the high cover position, 3,000 feet above the formation, scanning the sky for the dark specks that would resolve into enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe did not wait long. At 0947 hours, radar stations along the Dutch coast detected the inbound raid and scrambled Jagerschwader 1, a fighter wing equipped with FW-190A5s, some of the fastest and most heavily armed interceptors Germany possessed. The German pilots climbed aggressively, using their superior rate of climb to position themselves above the American formation before diving through the escort screen. It was a tactic that had worked countless times before. The P-47 Thunderbolts and Spitfires that typically flew escort could not match the 190's acceleration in a dive, and once the German fighters broke through, the bombers were exposed. But Chilton was not flying a Thunderbolt. At 1003 hours, he spotted the first wave of FW-190s beginning their attack run from 32,000 feet. He pushed the throttle forward and began a climbing intercept, angling to cut them off before they reached the bombers. The P-51B responded with a smoothness that felt wrong. Too easy, too fast. The altimeter needle climbed past 26,000, 28,000, 30,000. The engine temperature remained stable. The airspeed indicator held steady at 430 miles per hour in a 15-degree climb. Chilton had flown Mustangs for 2 years, and this was not how they behaved. The lead German fighter spotted Chilton's approach and broke left, assuming the American pilot would lose speed in the turn and fall away. Chilton followed, and the Mustang did not bleed energy. The turn radius tightened. The German pilot reversed, diving steeply to regain speed. Chilton followed again, and the P-51B accelerated past 450 miles per hour in a near-vertical descent. The FW-190, built for durability and firepower, began to buffet as it approached its structural limits. Chilton closed to 300 yards, 200, and opened fire. The German aircraft shuddered, trailing smoke, and spiraled toward the North Sea. Chilton pulled out of the dive at 18,000 feet and climbed back to altitude. His engine temperature gauge showed normal operating range. His fuel consumption was within projected limits. He had just performed a maneuver that should have overheated his engine, overstressed his airframe, or left him vulnerable at low altitude. Instead, he was back in position, scanning for additional threats. The modified cooling system had worked exactly as Harold West had predicted, but the real test came 20 minutes later. A second wave of German fighters, this time Bf 109 G6s from Jagdgeschwader 11, attacked from the south, climbing rapidly to engage the escort fighters directly rather than diving on the bombers. The 109 was lighter than the FW-190, with a better power-to-weight ratio and a higher service ceiling. In a sustained climb, it could outlast almost any Allied fighter. The German pilots knew this, and they used it tactically, forcing American escorts into energy-depleting vertical fights that left the bombers undefended. Chilton engaged a Bf-109 at 29,000 feet. The German pilot pulled into a steep climbing spiral, a maneuver designed to force the pursuing aircraft to stall or abandon the chase. Chilton followed, and the Mustang continued climbing. 31,000 feet, 32,000. The air was thin, the engine laboring, but the cooling system maintained optimal temperature by increasing thrust through the exit ducts. At 33,000 feet, the German pilot glanced back and saw the P-51 still closing. He leveled off, reversed, and tried to dive away. Chilton fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards. The 109's canopy shattered, and the aircraft rolled inverted, trailing fuel vapor. When Chilton landed at Boxted 3 hours later, his aircraft was immediately impounded. Engineers from Wright Field, who had been flown in undercover as maintenance personnel, swarmed the Mustang, measuring duct temperatures, inspecting fasteners, and photographing coolant residue patterns. They found no damage, no overheating, no structural stress beyond normal operational limits. The modification had survived combat conditions without compromise. But there was something else in the data, something unexpected. Chilton's fuel consumption during the mission was 11% lower than projected. The modified cooling system was not only reducing drag, it was improving overall efficiency by recovering waste heat that would otherwise have been lost. The Mustang was not just faster, it was more enduring. Its range, already impressive, had been extended by nearly 40 miles without adding a single gallon of fuel. This changed everything. The P-51's original design goal had been to escort bombers deep into Germany and return safely. With the modification, it could reach Berlin, a target that had been considered beyond the operational range of any single-engine fighter. If this held true across all aircraft, the entire strategic bombing campaign could be restructured. Bomber losses would drop, German industrial centers would become vulnerable, the war in the air would shift in favor of the Allies. Colonel Kelsey received the flight data on April 18, 1943, and immediately classified it above top secret. The report was hand-delivered to General Arnold with a cover memo that contained a single recommendation. Deploy the modification across all P-51 production immediately. Do not wait for additional testing. Every day of delay costs lives. Arnold approved the recommendation within 6 hours. Orders were transmitted to North American Aviation in Inglewood, and the first production P-51Cs with the modified cooling system began rolling off the assembly line in May 1943. Pilots were not briefed on the change. They simply noticed, mission after mission, that their Mustangs climbed faster, flew farther, and returned with fuel to spare. Harold West, still classified as a junior aerodynamicist, was transferred to a restricted engineering division and forbidden from discussing his work. Robert Chilton flew 37 more combat missions before being rotated back to the United States in August 1943. He never spoke publicly about the April 15th mission, and his official flight logs listed it as routine escort duty with no enemy contact. But the Luftwaffe noticed. German intelligence reports from mid-1943 began referencing a new variant of the American Mustang that could not be outrun or outclimbed. Pilots were advised to avoid prolonged engagements and to attack only when numerical superiority was guaranteed. By late 1943, the standing order was clear. If you see a Mustang, disengage. The mathematics had spoken, and the sky had listened. By June 1943, the modified P-51 Mustangs were arriving in England at a rate of 40 aircraft per week. They were distributed quietly across fighter groups stationed at bases in East Anglia, Debden, Leiston, Foulmere, each unit receiving a mix of older models and the new variants without explanation. Pilots noticed the difference immediately, but they attributed it to engine break-in, fuel quality, or psychological factors. No one suspected that the aircraft had been fundamentally redesigned without announcement. The secrecy was deliberate. Army Air Force's intelligence had concluded that if the Luftwaffe understood the source of the Mustang's improved performance, German engineers would develop countermeasures, either by modifying their own aircraft or by targeting the cooling system specifically during combat. A damaged radiator on a standard P-51 was a manageable emergency. A damaged radiator on a modified Mustang with its complex ducting and thermal management could be catastrophic. The advantage had to remain invisible. But invisibility created its own problems. Maintenance crews at forward bases were not trained on the new system. Technical manuals had not been updated. When a modified P-51 returned from a mission with coolant temperature anomalies or duct alignment issues, ground personnel had no guidance on how to diagnose or repair the problem. They improvised, using procedures designed for the older models, and in several cases, their well-intentioned repairs degraded the very system that made the aircraft superior. The first maintenance-related failure occurred on June 22, 1943, at RAF Debden. A P-51C flown by Lieutenant James Harmon returned from a bomber escort mission with a coolant temperature reading 15 degrees above normal. The crew chief, following standard procedure, assumed a blockage in the radiator core and flushed the entire cooling system with pressurized water. The flush cleared the blockage, but also dislodged the spring-loaded actuator that controlled the exit duct angle, the key component of Harold West's adaptive design. The actuator, no larger than a fountain pen, was swept into the waste coolant and discarded. The following day, Harmon took off on another mission. At 26,000 feet, his engine began to overheat. He reduced throttle, descended and limped back to base, with temperatures approaching critical limits. When engineers examined the aircraft, they found the exit duct locked in a partially closed position, unable to adjust to changing thermal loads. The Mustang had lost its adaptive capability and reverted to a standard cooling system, functional but no longer exceptional. The incident was reported to Wright Field, and within 72 hours, a team of engineers arrived at Debden with revised maintenance protocols and a classified technical supplement. But the damage had been done. The engineers discovered that 11 other modified Mustangs at the base had undergone similar maintenance procedures, and 8 of them were now flying with compromised cooling systems. The aircraft were still airworthy, but they had lost the performance edge that made them strategically valuable. Colonel Kelsey ordered an immediate audit of all P-51 units in England. The audit revealed a troubling pattern. Maintenance crews, unaware of the modification, were inadvertently sabotaging it through routine procedures. Coolant flushes, radiator replacements, and duct cleaning, all standard practices, were destroying the precision components that enabled the Meredith effect. In some cases, crews had even welded duct seams shut to prevent leaks. eliminating the thermal expansion properties that West had designed into the system. The solution was not simple. Informing every crew, chief and mechanic about the classified modification would compromise operational security, but continuing without guidance would result in the systematic degradation of the entire fleet. Kelsey proposed a compromise. A series of field modifications would be issued as routine technical bulletins, each one addressing a specific maintenance procedure without explaining why it mattered. Crews would be instructed to avoid flushing coolant systems unless absolutely necessary, to replace radiator components only with parts bearing specific serial numbers, and to never weld or modify the exit ducts under any circumstances. The bulletins were distributed in July 1943, framed as minor improvements to extend engine life and improve fuel efficiency. They were not classified, and they did not reference the Meredith effect or Harold West's design. They simply stated, in bureaucratic language, that certain procedures were now prohibited. Crews followed the instructions without question, and the performance of the modified Mustangs stabilized. But there was a second, more insidious problem emerging. Pilots were beginning to push the aircraft beyond its designed limits, assuming that if the Mustang could outrun a FW-190 in level flight, it could do anything. Several pilots attempted prolonged inverted flight, extreme G maneuvers, and sustained supersonic dives, none of which the cooling system had been tested for. In 2 cases, pilots reported sudden engine failures at high altitude, followed by forced landings in occupied France. Both aircraft were captured by German forces before they could be destroyed. German intelligence recovered the wreckage and immediately recognized that the cooling system was not standard. Photographs of the modified ducts were transmitted to the Reich Air Ministry, and by August 1943, Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf engineers were analyzing the design. They did not fully understand the mathematics behind it, but they understood enough. The Americans had found a way to turn waste heat into thrust, and if the system could be replicated, the Luftwaffe's performance disadvantage could be neutralized. The response from Berlin was swift. On August 19, 1943, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring issued a directive to all fighter wings. Captured P-51 Mustangs were to be preserved intact and transported to the Rechlin test facility for detailed examination. Luftwaffe pilots were ordered to avoid destroying the aircraft's midsection during attacks, focusing instead on wing and tail surfaces. The goal was clear. Germany needed to reverse engineer the modification before the Allies could deploy it across their entire fighter force. American intelligence intercepted communications referencing the directive in early September. The realization was immediate. The secrecy had failed. The modification was no longer invisible. And if Germany successfully replicated it, the technological advantage that had cost Harold West 6 months of sleepless calculation would vanish within weeks. General Arnold convened an emergency meeting at the Pentagon on September 12, 1943. The question on the table was stark. Should the modification be withdrawn from service to prevent further compromise, or should production be accelerated to deploy as many modified Mustangs as possible before Germany closed the gap? The debate lasted 4 hours. Some argued for withdrawal, citing the risk of losing the advantage entirely. Others argued for acceleration, pointing out that even a temporary superiority could turn the tide of air battles over Europe. Arnold made the final decision himself. The modification would not be withdrawn. Instead, it would be expanded. Every P-51 produced after October 1943 would include the system, and older models would be retroactively upgraded during scheduled maintenance. The risk of compromise was accepted. The priority was overwhelming numerical superiority. If the Luftwaffe could build 10 modified fighters, the United States would build 1,000. But there was one additional measure. Harold West was instructed to design a fail-safe mechanism, a way to destroy the cooling system if an aircraft was at risk of capture. The mechanism had to be simple, reliable, and triggerable by the pilot in seconds. West returned to his calculations and, within 2 weeks, proposed a solution. A thermite charge embedded in the exit duct actuator, activated by pulling a red-handled lever in the cockpit. If triggered, the charge would melt the actuator and weld the duct shut, rendering the system inoperative and unrecognizable. The failsafe was installed in all newly produced P-51s beginning in November 1943. Pilots were briefed on its use with minimal explanation. If forced to land in enemy territory, pull the red lever before exiting the aircraft. No one questioned it. In the chaos of war, one more emergency procedure was simply another thing to remember. By December 1943, the modified Mustang had become the standard. The aircraft that had begun as an unauthorized experiment was now the backbone of American fighter operations in Europe. And the blueprint that had been forgotten in a storage cabinet had become the most closely guarded secret of the air war. But secrets, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. They can only be defended. And the price of defense was about to be paid in the cold sky over Germany. On January 11th, 1944, the 357th Fighter Group, based at RAF Leiston, received orders for a maximum-range escort mission deeper into Germany than any single-engine fighter had previously attempted. The target was the Focke-Wulf assembly plant at Oschersleben, 200 miles southwest of Berlin, a facility producing the FW-190s that were bleeding bomber formations over occupied Europe. The mission would require the P-51 Mustangs to fly at combat power for nearly 4 hours, engage enemy fighters over the target, and return across 600 miles of hostile territory with minimal fuel reserves. The plan relied entirely on the modified cooling system. Standard Mustangs could not make the trip. Their range, while impressive, fell short by 40 miles, a gap that meant ditching in the North Sea or forced landing in enemy territory. But the modified aircraft, with their improved thermal efficiency and reduced drag, had demonstrated the necessary endurance in controlled tests. The problem was that no one had flown them operationally at maximum range under combat conditions. The mathematics said it was possible. The war was about to test whether mathematics was enough. 24 P-51Cs lifted off from Leiston at 06:20 hours under a low, overcast sky. The bombers they were escorting, 64 B-17s from the 91st Bomb Group, had departed 30 minutes earlier, climbing slowly toward the Dutch coast. The Mustangs caught up over the North Sea, slotting into escort positions above and behind the formation. Fuel consumption in the first hour matched projections. Engine temperatures remained stable. The pilots settled into the rhythm of long-range flight, scanning, checking instruments, managing throttle settings to conserve fuel without losing position. The first indication of trouble came at 8:04 hours, 80 miles inside German airspace. Lieutenant Raymond Dow, flying in the number 3 position, radioed that his coolant temperature gauge was fluctuating erratically, climbing to the red line, then dropping back to normal within seconds. His flight leader ordered him to reduce power and monitor the situation. Dow complied, throttling back to 90%, but the fluctuations continued. At 08:11 hours, his engine began trailing white vapor, a sign that coolant was escaping the system and vaporizing in the exhaust stream. Dow had 2 options: abort the mission and attempt to return alone across 300 miles of enemy territory with a failing engine, or continue to the target and hope the system stabilized. He chose to continue. His reasoning was tactical rather than heroic. A lone Mustang limping westward would attract every German fighter within radar range. His only chance of survival was to stay with the formation and use the group's collective firepower for protection. The bombers reached Oschersleben at 09:23 hours and began their attack run through heavy flak. The Mustangs held position, weaving above the formation to maintain speed without burning excess fuel. At 09:28 hours, German fighters appeared, 24 Bf-109s from Yugoslavia 3, climbing aggressively from the southeast. The American pilots dropped their external fuel tanks and engaged. The fight developed into a chaotic swirl of aircraft between 22 and 28,000 feet, both sides maneuvering violently to gain position. Dow's engine failed at 09:34 hours. The coolant leak, worsened by combat maneuvering, had drained the system below minimum operating level. The Merlin engine seized, the propeller windmilling uselessly in the thin air. Dow immediately declared an emergency and began a glide toward the west, hoping to clear the immediate combat zone before bailing out. His altitude was 24,000 feet, enough for a glide of perhaps 60 miles if he managed his descent carefully. But 60 miles would not get him out of Germany. He reached for the red lever, the thermite failsafe that would destroy the cooling system before the aircraft was captured. But before he could pull it, his wingman, Lieutenant Robert Ekman, radioed a proposal. Ekman would fly alongside Dow's unpowered Mustang and physically push it westward using his own aircraft's thrust, a technique called formation assistance that had been attempted occasionally in training but never in combat. The procedure was dangerous, fuel-intensive, and had a high probability of causing a mid-air collision. Ekman estimated it would cost him 15 minutes of fuel reserves, fuel he would need to reach England. Dow accepted. Ekman maneuvered his P-51 into position, carefully aligning his right wingtip beneath Dow's left wing, then applied power. The combined lift allowed Dow to stretch his glide, trading altitude more slowly for forward distance. They descended together, Ekman's engine laboring under the added load, Dow managing his flight controls with precision to avoid destabilizing both aircraft. They cleared the immediate combat zone, passing over farmland and small villages, German civilians staring upward at the strange sight of two American fighters locked in aerial formation. At 12,000 feet, Ekman's fuel warning light illuminated. He had 4 minutes of flight time remaining before his tanks ran dry. He radioed Dow, told him he had to break off, and wished him luck. Dow acknowledged and Ekman pulled away, turning west toward England at maximum economy speed. He would land at Leiston with less than 10 gallons of fuel, enough for 2 minutes of flight. If you found this story compelling, leave a like to help the channel. Dow continued gliding alone. At 8,000 feet, he crossed the German-Dutch border. At 4,000 feet, he was over occupied Netherlands, still too far from Allied lines to bail out safely. At 2,000 feet, he spotted a flat stretch of farmland near the town of Coevorden and committed to a wheels-up landing. The Mustang touched down at 1,007 hours, skidding across frozen soil for 300 yards before coming to rest against a low stone wall. Dow unbuckled, climbed out of the cockpit, and pulled the red lever. The thermite charge ignited with a white flash, melting the cooling system actuator and welding the exit duct into an unrecognizable mass of aluminum slag. Within 90 seconds, the mechanism that had made the P-51 Mustang the fastest fighter in the world was destroyed. Dow walked away from the wreck, hands raised, as German soldiers approached across the field. He was captured and held as a prisoner of war for the remainder of the conflict. His aircraft, partially burned and structurally compromised, was transported to a Luftwaffe salvage yard, where it was examined briefly before being scrapped for aluminum. German engineers noted the unusual duct configuration in their reports, but could not determine its function from the damaged remains. The secret barely held, but the mission itself was a failure. Of the 24 Mustangs that had departed Leiston, 3 did not return. 2 were shot down over the target. 1, Dow's aircraft, was lost to mechanical failure. The bombers suffered 6 losses, and the Focke-Wulf plant sustained only minor damage. The deep penetration escort strategy, which relied on the modified Mustang's extended range, had been validated in principle, but proven vulnerable in practice. The cooling system worked, but it could not compensate for combat damage, pilot error, or the statistical reality of war. Harold West received a classified after-action report on the mission in late January 1944. He read it alone in his office at North American Aviation, and when he finished, he placed it in a locked drawer and did not speak of it for the rest of the war. The mathematics had been correct, the engineering had been flawless, but the steel had broken anyway, not because of failure, but because war does not respect equations. The sound of Raymond Dow's Mustang hitting the ground in Coverton was heard by no one, except the man flying it. But that sound, metal on frozen earth, the echo of calculation meeting reality, would follow Harold West for the rest of his life. And the war continued, indifferent to both. By March 1944, the modified P-51 Mustang had been in operational service for nearly a year. Over 4,000 aircraft, equipped with Harold West's cooling system, had been delivered to fighter groups across Europe and the Pacific. Pilots praised the Mustang's performance in reports that never mentioned the modification by name. They simply wrote that the aircraft handled well at altitude or demonstrated exceptional endurance. Maintenance crews, still following the cryptic technical bulletins issued months earlier, serviced the cooling systems without understanding why certain procedures were forbidden. The secrecy had become institutional. No one knew the full picture except a handful of engineers and officers who were bound by classification orders that would not be lifted for decades. But inside that small circle, doubts were growing. The modification worked, but it had introduced vulnerabilities that the original design had not anticipated. The adaptive duct system, elegant in its simplicity, relied on mechanical components that were difficult to inspect and impossible to replace in the field. When an actuator failed, the aircraft lost its performance advantage but remained flyable, creating a situation where pilots believed they were flying a superior machine when in fact they were not. Several near disasters had occurred when pilots pushed modified Mustangs to their limits, unaware that a maintenance issue had degraded the system weeks earlier. The most troubling case involved Captain William Shomo of the 82nd Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, operating in the Philippines. On January 11, 1945, Shomo encountered a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by 12 fighters. Flying a modified P-51D, he engaged alone, shooting down 7 aircraft in a single mission, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. But post-mission inspection revealed that his cooling system actuator had seized 3 days earlier during a routine pre-flight check. Shomo had flown the entire mission with a compromised system, succeeding not because of the modification, but despite its failure. When Harold West learned of this, he requested permission to visit forward air bases and train maintenance crews on the proper inspection and repair procedures. His request was denied. The official reasoning was operational security. The more people who understood the system, the greater the risk of compromise. But there was another reason, unstated in the written denial. The Army Air Forces had concluded that the modification's psychological value exceeded its technical value. Pilots believed the Mustang was superior, and that belief translated into confidence, aggression, and tactical success. Informing them that the system could fail, or worse, that it might already be failing, would undermine morale at a critical point in the war. West was reassigned to a theoretical aerodynamics division in California, tasked with designing cooling systems for jet engines that did not yet exist. His work on the Mustang was archived under a restricted designation, and he was prohibited from publishing or discussing it. The classification would remain in place until 1973, 28 years after the war ended. By then, Harold West would be 64 years old, retired, and largely forgotten by an aviation industry that had moved on to supersonic flight and guided missiles. But in early 1945, the war was still being fought, and the Mustangs were still flying. The final major air battle involving the modified P-51s occurred on April 7, 1945, during Operation Tengo, a desperate Japanese attempt to defend Okinawa using massed kamikaze attacks. American fighter groups, including several equipped with P-51Ds, intercepted the attack wave over the East China Sea. The battle lasted 6 hours and involved over 300 aircraft. The Mustangs, operating at extreme range and in tropical conditions that stressed their cooling systems, shot down 74 Japanese planes without a single loss to mechanical failure. The success was attributed to pilot skill and tactical coordination. No mention was made of the cooling system in official reports. No credit was given to Harold West. The modification, still classified, remained invisible even as it continued to function exactly as designed. 3 weeks later, on April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in Berlin. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. The war in the Pacific ended on August 15th, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The P-51 Mustang, which had escorted bombers over Germany and fought in the skies above Iwo Jima, was rapidly phased out of service as jet fighters entered production. By 1950, most surviving Mustangs had been sold as surplus or converted to civilian racing planes. The cooling system modification, still classified, was stripped from many aircraft before sale. The components melted down and recycled. In 1958, a retired Air Force colonel named Benjamin Kelsey published a memoir titled The Dragon's Teeth, covering his career as chief of fighter projects during World War II. The book contained a brief passage about the P-51 Mustang's development, mentioning incremental improvements to thermal management systems without elaboration. The passage was vetted by Defense Department censors before publication, and several paragraphs were redacted. Kelsey, when asked about the redactions in interviews, said only that some contributions to the war effort remain properly classified. Harold West never published his own account. He worked quietly in the aerospace industry through the 1960s, contributed to the design of cooling systems for the Apollo program, and retired in 1970. He died in 1984 at the age of 75. His obituary in the Los Angeles Times described him as a respected aeronautical engineer whose work contributed to advancements in thermal dynamics. The P-51 Mustang was not mentioned. The blueprint that had transformed the Mustang from a capable fighter into the fastest operational aircraft of its era was declassified in 1973, along with thousands of other World War II technical documents. It was filed in the National Archives under the designation Engineering Modification 45427B Low-Drag Radiator Installation for P-51 series aircraft. The file contained West's original calculations, wind tunnel data, test flight reports, and a brief summary noting that the modification had been successfully implemented across production models, with no significant operational issues. The summary did not mention Robert Chilton's first combat mission, or the 11-minute test flight that had convinced the Army Air Forces to rebuild an entire fleet. It did not mention Raymond Dow's forced landing in the Netherlands, or the thermite failsafe that had preserved the secret. It did not mention the maintenance crews who had serviced the system without understanding it, or the pilots who had trusted their aircraft without knowing why it was different. It did not mention that the modification had extended the Mustang's range by 40 miles, just enough to reach Berlin and return. It did not mention that this 40-mile margin had allowed the strategic bombing campaign to continue when losses had threatened to make it unsustainable. It did not mention that the war in the air had been won, in part, by an equation that no one had wanted to solve. The file was 3 inches thick, bound in brown cardboard, and shelved in a climate-controlled archive where it remained untouched for decades. In 1998, a graduate student researching World War II aviation technology requested access to it as part of a doctoral thesis. The students spent 2 weeks photographing pages, transcribing calculations, and trying to understand why such a significant modification had been kept secret for so long. The thesis was published in 2001 under the title Thermal Efficiency and Strategic Impact: The Hidden History of P-51 Cooling System Development. It received little attention outside of academic circles. Aviation historians acknowledged it as a footnote, a technical curiosity that clarified minor details about an aircraft whose legend had already been written. But the student included one observation in the conclusion that went unnoticed at the time. The modification succeeded not because it made the aircraft invincible, but because it made the aircraft sufficient. It provided just enough advantage at just the right moment to tip the balance of an air war that was being decided by margins too small to measure in anything other than lives. That, perhaps, was the truth that Harold West had understood from the beginning. The equation had never been about speed or altitude or range. It had been about sufficiency, about closing a gap that was killing people. And the blueprint had done exactly that, quietly, invisibly, without recognition, the way most wars are actually won. In 2003, the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum began a comprehensive restoration of P-51D serial number 44-73877, one of the few surviving Mustangs with documented combat service in both the European and Pacific theaters. The aircraft had been discovered in a private collection in Arizona, partially disassembled and missing several key components. The restoration team, led by senior curator Robert van der Linden, intended to return the aircraft to flight-worthy condition as a living exhibit demonstrating World War II aviation technology. During the initial inspection, the team discovered something unexpected. The radiator cooling system did not match the technical specifications in the P-51D maintenance manual. The exit ducts were angled differently, the coolant routing was more complex than standard, and there was an unusual spring-loaded actuator embedded in the ventral scoop that served no apparent function according to official documentation. The team assumed it was a field modification, a common practice during the war when ground crews improvised solutions to maintenance problems. But when they cross-referenced the serial number with archived engineering records, they found a classified designation, EM4427B. Van der Linden requested the declassified file from the National Archives and received, 6 weeks later, a digital scan of Harold West's original blueprint. The accompanying documentation confirmed that the modification had been installed in over 15,000 P-51 aircraft between 1943 and 1945, making it one of the most widespread engineering changes of the war. Yet it had remained almost entirely unknown outside of a small group of engineers and historians. No aviation museum had documented it. No popular history had analyzed it. The modification that had defined the Mustang's performance had been hidden in plain sight for 6 decades. The restoration team made a decision. They would preserve the modified cooling system intact rather than replacing it with standard components. The aircraft would be displayed with informational panels explaining the system's function and historical significance. It would be one of the few P-51s in the world that visitors could examine to see how the modification had actually been implemented. The restoration took 4 years. The aircraft was unveiled at the museum in 2007, accompanied by a small exhibit titled Engineering the Edge: How a Forgotten Blueprint Changed the Air War. The exhibit included a replica of West's original calculations, photographs of the actuator mechanism, and testimony from surviving pilots who had flown modified Mustangs without knowing they were different. Attendance was modest. Aviation enthusiasts appreciated the technical detail, but the exhibit did not attract significant media attention. The P-51 Mustang was already legendary. The story of its cooling system seemed, to most visitors, like a footnote, But one visitor paid close attention. In August 2008, a man in his 80s named Robert Chilton arrived at the museum unannounced and asked to speak with the curator. He identified himself as the test pilot who had flown the first combat mission in a modified Mustang in April 1943. He had never spoken publicly about it, bound by classification orders that had only been formally lifted in 2006. He wanted, before he died, to see the aircraft one more